Once upon a time, in a small, cosy village, there lived a poor but kind-hearted shoemaker named Hans. He worked hard every day, stitching and sewing to make shoes for the people in the village. But no matter how hard he worked, he always seemed to be just a little short of making ends meet. One chilly evening, Hans sat by the fire with his wife Greta, looking at the last piece of leather he had left. "This is all we have," Hans sighed. "It's just enough for one pair of shoes. After that, I don't know what we'll do." "Don't worry," Greta said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You've always made the finest shoes in the village. I'm sure things will turn around." Hans smiled at his wife's faith in him and decided to cut the leather into pieces before going to bed, ready to work on it first thing in the morning. But something magical happened that night. As the clock struck midnight, two tiny elves dressed in rags crept into the shoemaker's workshop. "Let's help Hans," whispered one elf, his voice as soft as the wind. "He's always been so kind." With that, the elves set to work. Their tiny hands moved so quickly that it was as if the leather danced in their fingers. They stitched and sewed, tapped and hammered, and before long, they had made the most beautiful pair of shoes. The leather shone, the stitches were perfect, and the shoes seemed to sparkle with a little bit of the elves' magic. Just as the first rays of the sun peeked through the window, the elves quietly slipped away, leaving the shoes on the workbench. The next morning, Hans awoke early and went straight to his workshop. When he saw the shoes, he gasped in surprise. "Greta, come quickly!" he called. Greta rushed in and stared in amazement. "Hans, these shoes are perfect. Did you make them?" Hans shook his head in wonder. "I don't know how they got here, but these are the finest shoes I've ever seen." Later that day, a wealthy merchant came to the shop. When he saw the shoes, he insisted on buying them for a great sum of money. Hans and Greta were overjoyed. That night, with the money from the shoes, Hans bought enough leather for 2 more pairs. Just like before, he cut the leather and left it on the workbench. And again, as the village slept, the elves returned and worked their magic, creating 2 more pairs of beautiful shoes. This went on for many nights. The elves would come and craft shoes so fine that people from far and wide came to buy them. Soon, Hans and Greta were no longer poor. They had everything they needed, and their hearts were full of gratitude. One night, Hans and Greta decided to stay awake and see who was helping them. They hid behind the curtain in the workshop and watched in amazement as the tiny elves appeared and started working. "We must thank them," Greta whispered. "They have done so much for us." The next day, Hans and Greta made tiny clothes and shoes for the elves. That night, instead of leather, they left the gifts on the workbench. When the elves arrived and saw the tiny clothes, their faces lit up with joy. They quickly dressed in their new outfits, danced around the workshop, and then, with a twinkle in their eyes, they disappeared into the night. Hans and Greta never saw the elves again, but they never forgot the kindness that had changed their lives forever. And so, the shoemaker and his wife lived happily ever after, always grateful for the little elves who had brought magic into their lives.